This program is brought to you by the Merdeka Award, an initiative to promote excellence by ExxonMobil, Petronas, and Shell.
Hello and welcome. This is the Merdeka Award Roundtable. My name is Cynthia Ng. Today we will be discussing on the topic of biodiversity. Now, biodiversity is essentially a variety of living things in an ecosystem, and that largely forms the basis of human existence. Now, to put it simply, biodiversity is our life support system. Now, sadly is right now, the world is experiencing a dramatic loss of biodiversity, often resulting from unsustainable development driven by economic and social factors. So finding that right balance between conservation and development, that is a question, and how do we get there? And to give us some answers, I'm joined by a group of very passionate people who's leading efforts in their respective areas to help protect biodiversity. Please welcome, I have Ms. Elizabeth John, Senior Communications Officer for Traffic Southeast Asia. Now, Traffic is a wildlife monitoring network dedicated to conservation and building awareness on wildlife issues like poaching and trafficking. Welcome, Elizabeth. Next, we also have Professor Dato Dr. Abdul Latiff Mohamad, Emeritus Professor of University Kebangsaan Malaysia. Professor has more than 40 years of research in taxonomy and biodiversity under his belt. He is also a joint recipient of the Merdeka Award 2015 in the Environment category. Welcome, Professor. Now, next to me, I have Tan Sri Dr. Zakri Abdul Hamid. He is the Science Advisor to the Prime Minister, also the joint recipient for the 2015 Merdeka Award category in the Environment, and numerous other accolades which probably I couldn't have enough time to mention, but suffice to say, Tan Sri has been at the forefront championing biodiversity in Malaysia as well as at the global stage. Now, I'd also like to welcome Mr. Henry Goh. He is the President of Malaysian Nature Society, no stranger as a voice in advocacies for conservation initiatives. And rounding off this panel, I'm joined by Julian, Hyde, General Manager of Reef Check Malaysia. Now, Reef Check is dedicated to conservation of reefs and raising awareness on their importance. Now, once again, thank you so much for coming to this show and to talk about biodiversity. And I'd like to start with this question, because biodiversity has been talked about, but maybe not as often as it should. Maybe Tan Sri can start with helping us understand just how important is diversity to people like you and me.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you said in the introduction, biodiversity is our life support system. And some people would like to call it as our web of life. And biodiversity and the services it provides, also known as ecosystem services, provide mankind with food, with feed, water, clean air, and all the works. But right now, as you also rightly pointed out, it's under threat. In fact, globally, 60% of the ecosystem services that we are used to receiving from nature is being degraded. Now, the world is not standing still. There's a lot of efforts to examine what can be done. In fact, this issue about biodiversity and ecosystem services started a long time ago, when American scholar and author named Rachel Carson, in her book, The Silent Spring, calls for better appreciation of nature. So to make a long story short, during the Earth Summit in 1992, biodiversity is one of the issues that were being debated, negotiated, and agreed upon at the Earth Summit. And the other one, as you know, is climate change. But you also pointed out, in spite of all that, the issue of biodiversity has not really transpired through society. And this is where I think we need to do more to create more dialogue between the scientists, between the passionate NGOs, with the politicians, with the policymakers, with the industry, so that our life support system could be ensured, could be assured right to future generations. This is where we are at.
All right. So, but first, I suppose, to create that awareness, one has to understand just how important is biodiversity, and also what are the implications should we lose biodiversity. Professor, if you could enlighten us on that.
It is a simple, I would say, equation. When as a professor in the university, a teacher in the university, we have been teaching the subject of biology, environment, from the primary school right to the tertiary level. And we have been disseminating the concept of life support system, the concept of biodiversity, the plants, the animals, and all the interaction at all levels. And of course, I believe, we have done, or rather the academia in Malaysia have done a wonderful job. But then again, as Tan Sri pointed out correctly just now, that if you go down to the street and ask the same people whom we taught 10 to 15 years ago, they would say negatively that they have not understood the importance of plants and animal or biodiversity environment. And yet these people are committing the same, I would say, degrading mechanism and processes that we have rather witnessed in the last many decades. So public awareness is important. I'm also involved with the NGOs, and we have done the similar thing that Tan Sri mentioned, i.e. engaging the industries, engaging the public, the school children, and we thought we have done a good job. We believe we have done enough, but then again, there is no agency to evaluate whether enough is enough or whether have we done a good job. If you ask people on the street, majority will say we haven't done enough. But that's not right at all.
All right, so from the academy point of view, now let's get to people who are undertaking those efforts on the ground. Let's start with Elizabeth, looking at from the wildlife perspective. What are some of the biggest threats that you are seeing in that space in Malaysia?
Well, for wildlife, poaching is a huge threat. Many local people are involved in going out and hunting, many without licenses, and their targets are the animals native to Malaysia that are already on the brink. Things like tigers, deer, pangolins, we see them collected in thousands and in every seizure that you see on television. So poaching and smuggling are one of the biggest threats you have facing wildlife today. But one thing that we are seeing that's causing the problem to escalate even further is what people are doing online. Mm-hmm. Now, we recently released a study where we looked at 14 Facebook groups in Peninsular Malaysia that buy and sell wildlife online, right? And just from 30 minutes a day for 5 months, from just these 14 groups, we found people selling over 300 animals, most of them protected under Malaysian laws, not supposed to be online bought or sold. And and in total, these 14 groups had about 70,000 members. And that's just looking at Peninsular Malaysia. So, you have the threat on the ground from people who are going into the forest and getting the animals out, from people who are trading them through ports and airports or smuggling them. And you also have this whole group of Malaysians who are buying and selling them online. Okay. So the threats are enormous.
All right, I want to get more into the trading issue of this, the entire problem that we're having, but I'd like to get to Henry. As Elizabeth pointed out, we are facing new kind of threats. We are seeing, for example, orang-utans being sold online, and there is such a massive demand for this kind of products, and unfortunately, so from your work as an NGO and looking at all these threats, what can you tell us in terms of our efforts in stopping this in Malaysia?
I think from the work that we have done, like what, taking from what Prof. Latiff has mentioned, we do a lot of outreach programs We do a lot of awareness creation amongst the youth, amongst the public, and all these are being done to actually create a better understanding on the importance of all the wildlife and also the birds. We take the birds quite lightly, but birds are actually at the top of the food chain, and anything that happens to the birds is an indicator of the health of the particular landscape. And here with MNS, we are actually doing the protection of the flyway. We call it, we are part of the East Australian Asian Flyway, where on a yearly basis we have this migratory waders, migratory birds. And in fact, there's also this program that we do every year called the Raptor Watch, which will be happening this Saturday at Tanjung Tuan. All this information are being put together and shared with countries along the flyway so that we could collectively try to protect the habitats where these wildlife, the birds, and also to some extent the animals that habitate in this particular landscapes, to ensure that they have at least a good chance of survival. And then the indication of success is essentially the multiplication of this wildlife. If we see that the result is positive, then collectively I think we should congratulate and say ourselves and say that we have done something good.
I'd like to speak to Julian, who's going to tell us more about what's happening in our coast, in our marine biodiversity. So that's coming up. Don't stay away, we'll be back shortly. Hello and welcome. You are tuning into the Merdeka Award Roundtable, where we are discussing on the topic of biodiversity, which is timely given at this point of time we are facing probably one of the strongest El Nino phenomenon in almost 2 decades. And right now I'd like to get to Julian, who is the General Manager of Reef Check Malaysia, just to tell us more about how climate change such as El Nino is affecting our corals and our marine biodiversity in Malaysia.
Well, potentially catastrophic effects. Warm seawater can, over a period of weeks, kill corals. It's that simple. The water is warming. All of the data we have from satellite information, from data loggers in the water, all of it is suggesting a warming trend of water. And if the water stays too warm for too long, and we're only talking 1, maybe 2 degrees centigrade for 4 to 6 weeks, perhaps a little more, then there could be widespread coral mortality. Now, one of the problems that we face, and with respect to Prof about the work that you've done on education and outreach and awareness, frankly, I don't think we've got there yet. I did a straw poll in the office this morning for three different, what does biodiversity mean? And we're talking a master's student and somebody who's a degree in environmental sciences, and somebody, the office junior. I got 3 different answers, and none of them were comprehensive. And I think if we cannot express what biodiversity is, what chance the man on the street is going to understand it? So when we deal with what I call the invisible ecosystem, because most people don't actually see coral reefs, we have an even bigger problem. We need to find even more creative ways to explain it. But if you talk about coral bleach, well, corals go white and they're bleached and they die. Well, that's the short answer. But why does that matter to people if they don't see it? Well, because if the reefs die, the fish will die off. Because most fish, well, many marine species are associated with coral reefs, at least in part of their life cycle. And most Malaysians like fish, so, no more seafood. Does that sort of message work? It's pretty direct, it's pretty straightforward. It gets a response from people, but it's not a lasting response. And I find that a lot of the time we have conversations with people, they'll say, well, I understand what you're saying, but it's not going to make me change my habits. There's nothing in there, there's nothing in our messages, all of the work we're doing, I'm sorry to say, that's sticking with people, apart from a passionate few. Going back to what Tan Sri said earlier on, the idea of ecosystem services, they're incredibly valuable. But again, talk to the man on the street. Do they really understand what ecosystem services are? I'm not convinced.
So what do you suggest? I mean, in your line of work, what more can be done?
I think we have to, the approach that we're taking now is to stop trying to do widespread education campaigns. We're too small. And to go onto the ground and to work directly with the communities who rely on these things and plan to do work over a 5 or even 10-year period. So you take kids out of school at 11 years old, you start educating them then, you carry on educating them through secondary school, they go into the workforce, they're continually being given these messages, and I'm talking about a small community like Pulau Tioman, for example, Pulau Perhentian, small community, strong message about the value of the ecosystem services, of the forests on the island, of the marine ecosystems around the island, and continually telling them every single day to get that message through to a whole generation who will then be able to pass it on to the next. But if we do a campaign here, a campaign there, and it lasts a week, it lasts 3 months, there's no stick.
But I guess the other question is that how do you get the buy-in from local communities? How do you incentivize people to take part? For example, I'd like to cite something that's happening in Sabah in the Kinabatangan Corridor of Life. There's a project which seeks to connect this fragmented forest patches and swamps, but facing major stumbling block in the sense that locals are unwilling to give up land for conservation. So it comes down to the debate on conservation and economic growth. So how do we deal with that, given there is a necessity for human beings, sense that they need the land for survival, and on the other hand, we have the depleting resources and the natural heritage.
If I can answer that, I have been the chairman of WWF for the last 12 years, and presently I'm the president. And we have been doing fantastic job in Sabah with the local money, with international funding, at the place you mentioned, the Kinabatangan, the Corridor of Life, also at Sampurna, also at Kudat. Now we have